So I thought I would go ahead and record some kind of context videos so that way when we're in class, we can focus instead on kind of answering questions and talking about women in particular. Because the reality is the part of women's history that I think is going to be really kind of fascinating during this time period is going to be kind of looking at, conservative women and kind of the pushback and issues about Hillary Clinton and all that kind of stuff and the role of women in the military. So I thought I would kind of record this way. We can let the class go where it may, and we don't have to feel constrained that, I have to cover these PowerPoints because you will have access to them. So if I get to them, great. If I don't, great. So let's kind of talk about the 1970s. This won't take very long. So the big thing is Nixon wins. He comes in 68. He will bring about the end of Vietnam. And he's problematic because he actually kind of interfered with the peace process in 1968. But he ultimately will become president, and he's far from perfect when you're talking about Vietnam. He ushers in kind of a bombing campaign that's very controversial. This will lead to the Kent State shooting and this kind of thing. He'll start bombing in Cambodia and Laos, and that will kind of destabilize those countries. And so a lot of that stuff happens, but and so it's not nice and neat by any stretch of the imagination. But he will sign a ceasefire. He will get us out. You'll have the fall of Saigon. Vietnam will ultimately unify under a communist regime. And you'll have the passing of the 26th Amendment that will give 18-year-olds the right to vote. And the other part of this too, under Nixon, so when LBJ, when you have the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 64, you have the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which actually gives the president these broad kind of war-making powers. And in 1973, Congress passes the War Powers Act, which actually restricts the president so that he can only send troops for 90 days. If it goes more than 90 days, he has to seek congressional approval. And so now you could argue that we have the act, of 2003 that allowed us to go into Afghanistan and Iraq. No, allowed us to go into Iraq. And that bill is the Global War on Terror, right? That has often been interpreted as having been a little bit too broad a power for the president to make war, because all he has to do is say, well, it's against terrorism, so I can do this. So we've got some modern concepts of that, but you do have an attempt in 73 to kind of take back some of the congressional war-making powers. So on one hand, he does that, but he also ushers in the Environmental Protection Agency, so that gets protected. And he will do some things. The Great Society programs had been struggling. And he kind of turns a lot of those into block grants, kind of lets states have more control, which in some ways can be good. That's problematic because states don't always implement things the same way. But typically speaking, that's seen as trying to fix some of the problems of the Great Society programs. And of course, notably, he's the president when we put a man on the moon in August of 69. And deals with a lot of different groups. This is part of why he's going to be very paranoid, right? Is that there's lots of protest groups and all this kind of stuff, and he really kind of feels this. And he will really kind of get the support of the South that has really felt rejected by the Democratic Party because LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and they don't like all that rapid change, and so they're going to turn to the Republican Party. The Republican Party will wrap themselves in the flag and in law and order, and Nixon's going to lead the charge on that, right? Opposing busing, all that kind of stuff. And so Nixon's kind of an interesting character. Again, he's very kind of paranoid, comes from the California political machine. So he, long political career, going back to the 1940s and dealing with the House Un-American Activities Committee. And so he's an interesting guy. So he's very conservative, but in some ways he can be very liberal. Like I said, the EPA, you have him really kind of promoting some women's equal pay and equal rights a little bit. He opens up our foreign policy. He visits China and kind of creates a trade relationship with China. He creates detente with the Soviet Union, creates nuclear arms treaties to kind of get us to stop spending so much money on military stuff. But part of what's happening in the 70s is that inflation is getting really bad. And so the economy is starting to struggle, right? Like we've had all this military spending, we've had all these social programs, and the deficit's big and the economy's slowing down. And what do we do about this, right? And it's also in the midst of this around 1973 when you have the Yom Kippur War and OPEC kind of feels like the United States kind of intervened. They're going to issue an oil embargo, and that's going to drive prices up. So the economy is really struggling in the 70s, and it's starting under Nixon. Nixon's trying to deal with this, and it's into the midst of all this foreign policy in Vietnam and social change and economic problems that Nixon is trying to run his 72 campaign. And so he is a little bit paranoid and basically has a group of people called the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, and that's not a joke, that's real. They break into the Democratic headquarters to steal some information. They get caught. There's a cover-up, and over a period of several months, information comes out, and it starts becoming clear that the president was aware of that things were happening. Now we don't know whether he actually authorized and said, yes, please go do this. But we do know that after it happened, he was actively engaged in covering it up and moving campaign money around to help pay bribes to help keep those people quiet. And so lots of unethical tactics taking on. And so this is what's going to happen in 1972. And so he's going to be accused of obstructing justice and abusing his executive privilege. There's, the big court case over the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg, who worked for the State Department, releases in, don't quote me on this, but 72, 71, something like that. The Pentagon Papers, which is a State Department analysis that on Vietnam that basically said, that we should have never gotten involved. And it really kind of indicates that the government had not been honest about what was happening in Vietnam. And it looks really bad. Now, the funny thing is, it doesn't actually hurt Nixon, right? It's all about LBJ and Kennedy and Eisenhower. But Nixon's furious about it. And so he really tries to squelch the Pentagon Papers, and they target Daniel Ellsberg. And so that becomes a huge thing. You have him trying to use his office of the president to keep his Watergate tapes secret. The Supreme Court says, no, you have to turn those over. And so it becomes very clear that the articles of impeachment are drawn up from the House. And the Senate basically goes to him and says, yeah, you don't have support in the Senate. So he will choose to resign. And he resigns. Now, his vice president had also had to resign because he'd been accused of accepting some bribery. So his vice president was a shady character. And so Gerald Ford, the Speaker of the House, had become his vice president. So in 74, Nixon resigns, and you're going to have Gerald Ford becoming the president. So you have kind of problems there. So as Ford's becoming president, you have this economic crisis, right? And part of this is triggered by the OPEC oil embargo. Part of it's triggered by, all the money and this causing the rise of goods. And then you also have kind of a decline in manufacturing, right? You have this movement to the Sun Belt. You're starting to have mechanization. The cost of oil is causing people to stop buying American-made cars. We start having these global trade agreements with China and with Japan, and that starts bringing in cheaper goods. And so you have a whole confluence of problems that are taking place. And the question is, what do we do about it? And this kind of shows you pictures from the oil crisis of the 70s, and they literally had to ration gas. I was born in 71, so I was pretty young when this happened, but I remember my parents talking about what days they could buy gas, and how much gas they were allowed to buy, and really having conversations. Well, can we go here because we can only buy this much gas this week. And so basically the whole experience with Nixon and Ford is going to lead to a lot of distrust in the government. People are going to be very distrustful, especially after Vietnam. They're frustrated with the Middle East and the OPEC and what's happening there. They're frustrated with all these different social movements, and they're kind of exhausted. So I kind of think how in the 1920s people were like, oh, we're so tired of trying to fix everything. And so Ford will ultimately, he'll pardon Nixon to try to move the country past that. And he's going to be kind of not a very popular president. He's not bad necessarily. He's really only around for a couple years. He'll run for president in 1976, but will lose. So really he doesn't do anything. I think the biggest thing is the Helsinki Accords. He recognizes Eastern Europe as communist. So in 76, Jimmy Carter comes in, and he's, people kind of embrace him. He's seen as a political outsider, as a governor of Georgia. And he really kind of struggles to kind of build kind of the political coalition he needs. And he has kind of this mixed bag of results, right? And so you end up having lots of problems with the economy, even more so. And then you throw into this the Iranian hostage crisis. You have an Iranian revolution, and the Shah kind of leaves Iran, and the U.S. lets him come in to seek medical treatment. And this causes the Iranians to kind of take over the American embassy and hold hostages for like 444 days. And so that makes Carter look really bad. And he just, he gives this speech where he talks about, that America needs to, fix its spirit, that, we need to stop feeling sorry for ourselves. And he just doesn't really resonate with people. He does have a big foreign policy win. He does, make a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. But ultimately, that's pretty much it, right? He's still known as being an advocate for human rights and kind of Habitat for Humanity. So he's still a big human rights person, and he always was. Very principled stance, right? But politically speaking, I don't know that he was the greatest at politics. And so Carter's foreign policy is going to kind of so you really have the sense all throughout the 70s that life is, it's just not very good. The economy's bad, and people are frustrated, and it's into the midst of all this. You have disco and kind of that city life and all that kind of stuff, the urban decay that comes in, because cities are starting to really kind of show their age in a lot of ways, and lots of concerns about energy conservation, LGBTQ. The ERA fight starts in the 1970s, so that's kind of happening. Again, Nixon was actually fairly friendly towards women. Carter was perfectly fine too. It's not that. It's just that really the economic and kind of the oil situation becomes the big thing. The only thing I will say is that also happening in the 70s is going to be the evangelical conservatism. That movement is going to take hold, this idea of that the way to respond to these changes in society is to kind of go back to fundamentalism. And what's interesting about that is women are going to take the lead in this religious fundamentalism. You're going to have lots of women that are engaged in that, that fight for the family, right? And they're going to be kind of plugged into that, whether it's opposing busing, whether it's opposing abortion, and lots of criticisms about women in the workplace and women putting off having children. So there's going to be some interesting kind of nuances coming out of the 70s. Because they largely see these movements of the civil rights movement and, the anti-war and all that kind of stuff, and the second wave of feminism, especially as it existed under now, right? And even the Black Power movement. And people are going to say, well, whoa, wait a minute, that's too much change, right? That's remaking society, and we don't want to do that. And so this conservatism is really going to come back hard in the 1980s, and it has kind of its roots here. So again, I mentioned here, it sets the tone for domestic policies and social conflicts. It really, really does. A lot of what happens in the 80s and 90s is a reaction to what happened in the 70s. Whether you're talking about frustration of conservatives about the impeachment of Nixon, or whether you're talking about conservatives being upset over kind of liberal movements, or whether you're talking about, the various groups kind of wrangling for political rights. And then you're going to have global tensions, right? The Soviet Union, that's going to continue, although it looks different in the 70s and 80s. The big thing is they invade Afghanistan, and Carter boycotts the Olympics. Reagan will be the one that will really kind of bring an end to that. But you also begin to have problems in the Middle East as well. So the next one we'll talk about conservatism, and we'll talk about the 1980s, and I'll give you a little bit of the context so that while we're in class, we can dig into what women are doing.